The beginnings. Would you like to live in a world where everyone is equal, men, women, old and young, where everything is shared by everyone, and where everything is owned by everyone? Many people would call this a golden age, a utopia, a place of perfection. This is the idea behind communism. The ideas of communism are not new. The Greeks talked of a golden age 2,000 years ago. Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia in 1516, setting out many of these ideas. You may have heard that North Korea, Russia, or China are or were communist or socialist. What does this mean, and how did they become that way? Power in the hands of a few. Since the beginning of time, societies have been controlled by a ruler, often a chief, a king, or a queen. Power and money were in the hands of a few. Most people owned very little and had little or no power. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe was a time in history when people left their farms. They went to live in cities and work in factories. This made factory owners very rich. The owners' aim was to make money for themselves while paying others to work for them. This is how a capitalist society works. But the power was still in the hands of a few. Many factory owners became rich by forcing the workers to work long hours in dirty factories and by paying them very little. The workers were unhappy and began to protest. The Communist Manifesto. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels put forward the idea that capitalism would end because the workers would take control of society and establish a new society based on equality. This idea was called communism. The Spread of Communism. Marx's ideas grew in popularity in Europe and especially in Russia. One group called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, changed the course of world politics forever. In 1917, they took control of Russia and created the first communist country. Eventually, communist governments came into power in Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries. By the 1960s, communist governments had taken control of China, North Korea, Cuba, and elsewhere. Even some African nations such as Ghana and Mali became communist. A powerful Russia. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union, as Russia was then called, had control of much of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union felt strong and powerful, but it wanted more power and influence. However, many people did not like the Soviet Union's controlling style of government and the lack of personal freedoms. The Cold War. Most of the Western world, including Western Europe and the USA, wanted to keep a capitalist economy based on democracy and personal freedoms. Although there were no direct military battles, the Cold War lasted about 45 years. During this time, two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, tried to dominate the world. The Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union and the West tested their power and influence by supporting opposite sides in wars all over the world, in Vietnam, in Korea, and nearly in Cuba. There was even a war in space, a race to the moon. In Europe, the main example of this struggle for power was the Berlin Wall, which they began to build in 1961. It stretched for over 100 kilometers to cut Germany into the communist East and the capitalist West. The beginning of the end. Over time, the capitalist countries became richer and their people had higher standards of living. People in the communist and socialist countries were poorer. There seemed no reward for hard work, and their economies were bad. These people became unhappy with their governments. They didn't want their governments making all the decisions for everyone. They wanted to be free. (1989) Many countries under Soviet influence protested their control. In 1985, the new leader Mikhail Gorbachev relaxed the communist policies and its influence on its neighbors. In 1989, Germany began tearing down the Berlin Wall. Soon after, most of the Eastern European governments no longer followed communism as their political systems. Today, many of the governments who were once communist are now socialist. They allow some freedoms and allow people to own property, such as in Vietnam, Cuba, and China. Communism started as an idea to make life better for everyone, but in the end, most people rejected it. Today, most of the world is capitalist, but too much power and wealth is still in the hands of a few. What will the world's political system be like in the years to come?